I usually read fiction. I feel comfortable reading fiction. I have that persona in front of me to hide behind. I don't have anything to hide behind tonight. And the essay that I'm going to read, I felt needed to be written by me at this time in this place in America. And it's a painful essay. It's a painful essay to have written, and it may be a little painful to hear. I hope it's illustrative. Growing up in the basket of deplorables. If the past presidential campaign has taught us any lesson, it's this: we hate the other side. No matter what side we're on, it's not just that we disagree with the opposing side's policies or take issue with their ideas or question their motives. No, we hate them. Having lived through the divisiveness of the 60s, I find that era doesn't come close to convincing me, as does this one, that there is an us, which is good and kind and generous and right, and the them, which is equally bad and cruel and intolerable and wrong. How do I know this? I could cite learned academic studies that reveal national trends and polling data about the widening chasm separating Americans, but the clearest and most indisputable way to know the truth of this premise is that we are the daily beneficiaries of 140-character tweets which tell us that people on one side are indeed despicable. We have the moralist in chief to thank for clearing up any moral ambiguities we might otherwise feel about ourselves. At the same time, the person I supported and voted for after voting for Bernie informed us that the exact opposite is true. Hillary said that the other side was a basket filled with deplorables. From the moment that our gilded leader came down his gilded escalator with his gilded wife on his arm and railed against my basket, immigrants who stole our wealth, Mexicans who raped our women, Muslims who threatened our safety, elite intellectuals and fake writers who peddled dangerous mendacities, I felt surely I wasn't in that basket. I was in the other one, the good basket, filled, I assume, with fresh, wholesome fruit and organic vegetables. Think kale. But just what is a basket filled with deplorables? The word deplorable means something or someone that is worthy of censure or reproach, lamentable or wretched. What sort of wretched people did Hillary mean? Of course, she didn't specify, and no sooner had she said it than she started to equivocate in pure Hillary fashion. But you and I know who and what the deplorables are. They're those redneck, white trash, Duck Dynasty watching, tobacco chewing, gun toting, Bible thumping, racist, misogynist Neanderthals, the sort of people Obama said, quote, cling to guns and religion. Since I've convinced myself which basket I'm in, I've spent the past 2 years proselytizing against Trump and his fellow basket dwellers. I've occupied myself signing left-leaning petitions, dashing off indignant op-ed pieces, signing contributions to liberal-minded organizations, and doing a whole lot of high-minded cocktail party schmoozing and soapboxing against the other side. I haven't spent much time talking with or trying to convert them, which, given their commitment to staying in their own basket, would, I assured myself, be a complete waste of time. I feel good, i.e. smug, working on my progressive bona fides and being validated in my thinking by watching Rachel and Lawrence on MSNBC, reading the HuffPost and The Nation, and contributing to every MoveOn.org, Bernie Clone Action Committee, or Support John Ossoff. A lot of good that did. This work proves to me and to the world that I am not one of those from the other basket. Yet as deplorable as Trump is, and he is the most deplorable person who's ever held the office of the presidency, my point isn't really about him. No, it's about us. Perhaps not since the Civil War has it been so crystal clear what it means to be on one political side or the other, nor so easy to resort to righteous conflict with people from that side. The conflict has assumed the elements of a religious war, with all the appeals of God being on our side, while the other side is considered the incarnation of evil and of our moral right, indeed, our moral duty to harm our enemies. Think of Trump rallies where he tells his frenzied jihadists to strike his hecklers with impunity, or at least to throw them out on their infidel ears. Or on our side, the guy who felt justified in shooting Steve Scalise at a Republican baseball practice. I have lost friends, even family members, because I don't want to be thought of as giving comfort to the enemy in this new holy war of ours. To give an example, one of my brothers is a rabid, as in needing a rabies shot, Trump supporter. Wealthy, one of the 1%, trained as a lawyer. On the surface, he doesn't much resemble your typical Trump follower. He is yet without the least self-consciousness or slightest provocation, he'll spout racist or xenophobic or misogynist ideas that would have gotten him in trouble 50 years ago, let alone today. But like so many others, he's gotten a new lease on being able to give vent to his darkest and most despicable thoughts. If his Make America Racist Again leader can say deplorable things, why can't he? One night, just at the start of Trump's campaign, my brother came over to my house for a drink. We got into one of our usual heated debates about politics and gun control and social justice and race, a seemingly Mobius strip that we've been going round and round on for years. When he said something egregiously offensive even for him, I'd had it and ended up by throwing him out of my house. We no longer speak. That's true. I must admit, though, I took a certain pride in this fact, that I could even take a principled stand with a member of my own family. I take less pride in the fact that he and I came from the same racist, redneck, white trash gene pool. Though I hate to admit it, I see in my brother the lineaments of my own bigotry and ignorance. During the election campaign, I happened to see someone on TV being interviewed. The man was standing outside a Trump rally. He carried a Trump sign and wore a T-shirt that said, I'm a deplorable and proud of it. He was a white, middle-aged guy from, I assume by his speech and dress, some rural Rust Belt part of America, and his anger and bitterness with his lot in life was vividly apparent. He raged against the usual straw men, crooked Hillary, the elite faux media, an uncaring swamp-like government, vast hordes of others, quote-unquote others, who had slipped into his country and stole it from him. I bring up this guy and his pride in being part of his basket, not to say that everyone in my basket is good and everyone in his is bad. Rather, it's to say that whatever basket you feel you're a part of, you take a certain pride in identifying with members of it. However, as I listened to this guy vent his frustration, I slowly came to recognize something uncomfortably familiar about him, just as I had that night with my brother. It was as if I were looking in the mirror, at least the mirror I looked in my youth. You see, I grew up one of those poor, white, angry people that Hillary had called deplorables. The filmmaker Michael Moore has said that he understands and empathizes with those people, and having roots in that other American basket, I do as well. Moore and I, however, see this divide from very different angles. My angle of vision on the state of the white working class is closer to that of J.D. Vance in his Hillbilly Elegy, though I am hardly writing now to elegize the people I grew up with. Rather, my aim is simply to understand them, and thus myself. My father, a farmer who lived through the Great Depression, was stunted by its suffocating effects, prevented from going to college because his savings had been frozen during the bank closures. He was haunted by the long shadow of want and fear and poverty it had cast over the rest of his life. Having lived as the whites had since the American Revolution, on a hardscrabble Vermont dairy farm, my father left his family home in search of, like so many other Americans, a better life. He settled in Connecticut just after World War I. The better life he hoped to find proved elusive. He spent his time raising Holsteins and growing tobacco and doing some carpentry work when he wasn't too drunk to get it, and railing against his misfortunes. The drunkenness, similar to the opioid crisis today, was a means for him to escape his frustration and anger at his economic situation. While he didn't grow up in the South, he was, nonetheless, a card-carrying, hard-drinking, cuss-spewing, throw your beer can out the window, roll your own cigarette, hell with government, redneck in all meaningful ways. He literally had a permanently stained red neck from working under the scorching sun, and figuratively and psychologically, he embraced the redneck worldview. A narrow but proud and stubborn vision that was parochial, insular, tribal, fiercely independent, and all too white. His impoverished hand-to-mouth existence defined him, and by extension, his 4 sons. My 3 brothers and I grew up in an unheated attic, and our bathroom was an outhouse. We took our weekly bath in water he carted from the farm a quarter mile up the road, and which was boiled on a stovetop. One of my brothers still carries the third-degree scars from a scalding bucket of water falling on him when he was 3. My father was, like many of his generation in milieu, unabashedly racist. He divided the world into a familiar us and an alien them. The us were those who worked hard for a living, were invariably poor, refused handouts, and were, almost without exception, self-reflection, or apology, white. Whiteness wasn't just a skin color. It was an assumption, an ingrained state of mind, a privilege of birth, sometimes even a battle cry. The rest of the world were them, what we academics now refer to as the other. There were, of course, certain nuances among these divisions. For instance, there were some people who were wealthy who weren't quite so bad. One Jewish man my father sometimes worked for owned a sprawling chicken farm to which I came along on school vacations as a carpenter's helper. My father referred to the man openly and without the slightest sense that he was saying something inappropriate as a quote-unquote good Jew, presumably because he offered him free eggs, let him take home scraps of firewood, and once gave him a pint of whiskey for Christmas. Similarly, he divided African Americans into good blacks, those who didn't complain, worked hard, and kept quiet, and uppity or lazy blacks, those who spoke out against the status quo or received welfare. It didn't seem to strike my father as hypocritical or ironic that when he got sick, we accepted welfare, food stamps, Social Security disability benefits. Somehow in his mind, he'd earned those handouts. Another irony was that one of his best friends was an African-American man named Scotty, a bartender at one of my father's favorite gin mills. When my father would get really drunk, that is, more than his daily 2 six-packs and a pint, he'd give me, 13 at the time and without a driver's license, the keys to the Studebaker truck so I could chauffeur him home. On the way, as he drank whiskey straight from a pint bottle, and I tried to keep the truck on Water Street, my father would tell me how Scotty was one of the good ones, no doubt because he'd slip him a free drink now and then. My father had held similar opinions on all of the others in his world, meaning Catholics, Asians, immigrants, long-haired intellectual eggheads, pencil pushers, liberal Democrats, wealthy bankers, crooked lawyers, Jewish doctors, and just about everyone else who didn't have our skin color or hold our views or were part of our basket. Years later, when he was dying of lung cancer in a state hospital because he didn't have insurance, he was tended to by Indian oncologists, Jewish surgeons, black and Hispanic nurses, all of whom treated my father with kindness and generosity. I guess they didn't know he came from the other basket. We were what I would only much later come to realize, white trash rednecks. A seeming oxymoron in the mostly middle-class, affluent, and liberal confines of Connecticut. Yet the proximity to wealth and status only made my own minority status all the more pronounced and all the more shameful. You see, to be poor in America is to feel shame. I never invited any friends to my house because I was embarrassed by the smell of coal burning in the furnace, by having to explain the outhouse behind the barn, by the chickens rooting around in the front yard, by the dozen junk cars on cinder blocks scattered about our property as if it were a war zone, but mostly by what might slip out of my father's drunken mouth at any given moment. My mother, a second-generation daughter of Italian immigrants, had an 8th grade education, believed in old world superstitions like catching disease from those of a different skin color or ethnicity, and worked as a cleaning lady for the wealthy. Where my father resorted to alcohol and anger in response to grinding poverty, my mother sought oblivion in numerous drunken attempts at suicide. One winter day when I was 12, I found her half frozen in a brook out behind our barn and carried her home and put her to bed. On my first day of college, whose tuition I had paid for, I went out to the car I had purchased carrying the books I had bought, searching as my father had before me for a better life. When my mother asked me where I was headed that morning, I replied, "To college, Ma." Her response, which turned out to be prophetic in more ways than she intended, was, "You get an education, Mike, and make something of yourself." I knew that most college students had radically different first-day experiences, and after class I couldn't hang around with the SDSers to protest Vietnam or marching for civil rights because I had a full-time job to get to. The unfairness of my situation rankled me. This often amorphous but very real anger at life's fundamental injustice, that the deck was stacked against you, as Trump often says to stir up resentment among his angry base, remained with me through college, through my college days and beyond. It was emotion that was directed both upward, up the socioeconomic ladder, at all those who had more than I, who grew up with the proverbial silver spoon in their mouths, and downward, at those who had less but who might, through illegal actions or unfair government policies or the benevolence of wrong-headed Cadillac liberals like the Kennedys, take from me what little I had worked so hard to get. On the one hand, I hated the wealthy people whose houses my mother cleaned. Though she didn't clean their house, people very much like the Kennedys. It didn't matter to me that they had used their wealth and education and influence to help others, and that they devoted, and in 3 cases, sacrificed their lives to helping poor people, that is, people just like me. Like many of the working poor, I hated their inherited money, their private school accents, their self-confidence, their brilliantly white smiles, their fancy cars and big houses. Most of all, I hated what people like the Kennedys stood for. They seemed to be on the side of minorities and not on the side of people like me. Similar to the Southern Dixiecrats in the 60s, who were beginning to switch allegiance to the Republican Party en masse because of the Kennedy-Johnson civil rights legislation, I found myself by default a Republican. Not only because my father was one, but because the Republicans were able to manipulate that white anger, my anger, to their advantage. I knew little about Nixon's real policies other than the fact he surely didn't grow up with a silver spoon in his sullen mouth like Kennedy, and he surely wasn't on the side of them. He was on our side. Nobody had handed him a thing. He was someone who'd learned to fight dirty, to scratch and claw for everything he'd ever gotten. It didn't seem to matter to me that most Republicans supported policies that helped and abetted the rich, that promoted the unjust social, legal, economic blueprint for America, or that Nixon and his hawkish cronies would just as likely have sent my white trash ass to Vietnam, okay? And surely would have had it not been for the luck of the lottery draw. Like many of my fellow white working class poor, I was willing, as my father used to say, to cut off my nose to spite my face when it came to my political allegiance. I wasn't one of those young Republicans who wanted to keep their inherited privilege. No, I was the redneck sort, lured to that side against my own best interest. Out of spite and anger, jealousy and frustration, I could hear and approve the silent dog whistles that the Republican Party had started to blow in those days. Someone I felt was finally listening to my white needs, Certainly not my economic or social or legal needs, but the dark and twisted psychological needs of my angry tribe. You see, as with so many of the white working class and working poor, I developed that anger, vague, amorphous, unarticulated, in large measure unfounded, but nonetheless very real, a smoldering fire in the gut that told me I was unworthy, that I was unwelcomed in my own country, that I was, in a sense, deplorable. Michael Moore is correct when he says, quote, "There are two Americas right now and they're split economically." But I disagree when he goes on to say that that split is not based, at least in part, on race. I feel he's being too lenient on the white working class, too charitable, and not calling them to task for their collective sins. Sins both of commission and omission, especially for the sin in voting for someone like Trump. In fact, Moore himself goes on to admit that in this past November's election, quote, "misogyny, racism, and white privilege were on the ballot." They were indeed on the ballot, and they won. Just as I felt hate for those above me, so too did I hate those perceived being below me on the socioeconomic ladder. As a young man, I had unwittingly accepted my father's racist anger and all that that implied, a self-loathing that had to find someone else to blame for my own inadequacies and failures. I found myself aping my father's bigoted epithets. At an early age, I felt the caustic effects of living day to day, week to week, with that anger and that perverted vision of America. I sensed how corrosive it could be to one's psyche, how that anger could pollute and distort one's thinking. I saw it all around me, in my family and friends, in those in my rural Connecticut town, and in large swaths of this country. Even so, like that guy holding a sign that said he was proud to be deplorable, I sometimes felt that anger was all that I had, all that I could call my own. And I realized that made me part of the larger group to which I felt, albeit an uneasy kinship. So today, when I see Trump supporters angrily railing against immigrants and Muslims, decrying the fake media and the too smart for their own good academics, when I hear them crying out about innocent police, how innocent police are murdered and that white lives matter, when I take note of the clarion call to make America great again, in short, when I hear them pleading, like Robert De Niro's pathetic character in This Boy's Life, "What about me?" I don't condone, but I do recognize that anger. I don't understand it intellectually, but I do feel it in my bones. I know firsthand where such an emotion arises, from that black pit of self-hatred and frustration, from the feeling that everything is weighted against one, and how that feeling can get twisted into rage and blindness, and yes, racism. Several of my novels deal with the themes of bigotry and prejudice, racial and ethnic hatred. Soul Catcher, for instance, about a white slave catcher from the 1850s, presents a man who doesn't think he's racist, but merely, quote, following the law. The Garden of Martyrs, a story about Irish immigrants of 1805, shows the ethnic and religious animosity that existed towards both Irish and Catholics. And A Racing Heart, the novel I just finished and was going to read from tonight, explores the racism against Jews and blacks that existed not only in Third Reich Germany, but in America and the United States as well. Writing about such characters from both sides of any great moral divide, victims as well as victimizers, protagonists as well as antagonists, gives me some sense of the various baskets into which we like to put ourselves or to put others. I know how easily I could have stayed in that basket with my fellow angry white working class deplorables. I know many people who were born and are still in that basket. And let me be perfectly clear. I am not saying that all Trump supporters are deplorable or racist, or that the liberal basket is all commendable and right-minded. But I am saying that Trump's appeal signals a profound and troubling shift in what I'll call, quote, basket identity politics. Two of my brothers, for example, are still proudly, stubbornly, righteously in that basket. One, as I mentioned earlier, is wealthy. The other is poor. The wealthy brother feels that he acquired what he did solely by his own initiative and God-given talents, without the handouts that they, minorities, immigrants, women, you name the list of undeserving, received. And he wants a government that is more police force or prison than social arbiter. So will protect what he has, he feels, rightly earned. An ironic side note, for the last several years, he has been a silent recipient of Obamacare, a hypocrisy which, as with my father, he refuses to acknowledge. The poor brother, on the other hand, believes he was blocked at every turn from what rightly should have been his because the system was engineered against him. Like so many of the white working poor, he doesn't focus blame either inward upon himself and his alcoholism or upward at people like our brother, the wealthy one, whose class has all the legal and economic advantages. The latter group is too far removed from his experience and too clever in their propaganda campaign. Rather, he'd prefer to blame and rail against those around him at the bottom of the basket, who are in competition for the scraps thrown by the 1%. In fact, the poor brother aspired to be just like the rich one and feels he could have been if not for the others who robbed him of what rightfully should have been his. Though part of the working poor, like so many others, he swallowed hook, line, and sinker the American myth propagated by the rich and powerful that he too could be successful if not for factors outside his control. During the campaign, I saw a man on TV who was going to vote for Trump not because he liked his policies or his plan for America, but simply because Trump had, as he put it, nice houses, fancy cars, and beautiful women. As if by simply voting for Trump, all that could be his as well. I guess instead of Herbert Hoover's campaign slogan, "A chicken in every pot," the man believed that if Trump were elected, a beautiful woman would be in every bed. Is it possible for people to change? How does anyone become something other than what his or her genes or social environment dictates? How, that is, do we become something other than our fate? J.D. Vance suggests in Hillbilly Elegy that his own change was brought about by several factors, including the modifying influence of joining the Marines or going to Yale. As a novelist, I find the most interesting part of a story is when a character steps out of what I had preordained for him or her and changes their own identity. That is, when they take on a life of their own and do things I hadn't quite expected at the beginning. For if fictional characters couldn't evolve and change, I think I would quickly grow bored as a writer. For me, that's the magic and the mystery of writing novels, the unexpected evolution of a character from cowardice to bravery, from darkness to light, from ignorance to wisdom. And while people are not fictional characters, fiction is, I believe, a mirror of life. And I firmly believe that under the right circumstances and influences, they can change. In fact, they do change. So how did I manage to evolve from such pathetic ignorance and darkness to at least possessing a smidgen, and I want to say smidgen, of illumination? Like all those who experience a conversion, I had beneficent external influences as well as flashes of sudden revelation, gifts given to me undeserving, occasional moments of dumb luck, even a pinch of hard work. I feel reading is one of those singular, ennobling, and humanizing endeavors a person can pursue. For me, books are not just a fanciful journey away from reality and self, but a deeper plunging into both. Yet I grew up without the nurturing culture of books, without the illuminating effects of literature. Except for a few musty volumes in a box shoved in a corner of the attic, we had no books. Growing up, I was a jock, content to pursue a life of pure physicality. However, I previously mentioned I had 3 brothers, but till now I've only mentioned 2. The third brother, Charlie, proved to be the most influential in my development from ignorance to knowledge. 15 years my senior, born a kind of Dustin Hoffman Rain Man, autodidact genius, he somehow acquired the noble belief in intellectual attainment. In learning about the world and his place in it, he instilled in me a grand curiosity in that world, a pride in all things of the mind, and a sense of pleasure in the rigorous pursuit of truth. which meant looking beyond superficial answers to complex issues. It was from him, in large measure, that I learned to love reading. Like St. Augustine lying beneath the fig tree, hearing the words, "Take up and read, take up and read." In my last semester in high school, I finally began to take up books and read. I opened my heretofore closed mind to what philosophy and novels, stories and poetry and science could teach me. The summer before college, my brother gave me a book of essays on, of all things, 19th century German idealism. What on earth, you might well ask, did Kant have to do with a redneck farmer's son who was more interested in hitting home runs than in learning about noumena? Nevertheless, I grew fascinated by the teasing notion that the world around us might not be fully real, that it was just something our senses perceived, that all human experience shares certain essential structural features. I found myself suddenly united with a much larger and more interesting tribe than the one I'd previously been a member of. That summer, I also read novels, for the first time, actually. Somehow, I managed to slip through almost 12 years of public education without having read a single novel. I cried at the end of Farewell to Arms, felt pity for Quasimodo in Hunchback of Notre Dame, shared the courage and hope of Dr. Roux in The Plague. I took a book out of the library on evolution, another on Freudian theory. These books suddenly opened my eyes beyond my own myopic sense of victimhood and blame and racial identity. They introduced me to real suffering, to the thoughts and feelings and struggles of others very different from me. Earlier, I purposely employed the term evolve. The Latin term homo sapiens means man knowing. But the word homo sapiens sapiens, we humans, means man knowing that he knows. Think for a moment of the profound implications of that. We humans are the only species that not only knows something, but is aware of that knowing, i.e., a mind looking inward. Therefore, a mind that is not only self-aware, but one that can be self-critical, and thus one that can change what and how it thinks. Reading started me on a long journey of becoming self-aware, of knowing that I was knowing, but also reading gave me a profound sense of all that I didn't know about the world. Vast, uncharted territories of human experience, of the lives of others very different from mine, lives I had been deeply ignorant of. Not coincidentally, almost at the same time that I began to read, I realized I wanted to write. To me, reading and writing became two sides of a single coin of knowledge. As a matter of course, novelists need to be self-reflective, looking beyond the surface of our characters to their deepest secrets, hopes, and fears. I quickly realized that if I were to become a novelist, I would need to understand and grow well beyond my own narrow, solipsistic world of anger and resentment and prejudice. I would have to enter the world of others in order to write about them. In another essay, I speak about the importance for a writer of what I call the empathetic imagination. That is, the need for a writer to be able to think and feel like others in order to enter their world and write about them credibly. Reading took me, is still taking me, further into understanding others and therefore as writer and human being into understanding myself. This was and is a very long and arduous and never-ending journey. But in addition to long journeys, sometimes change comes suddenly, unexpectedly. There are those watershed moments, those sudden joyous epiphanies, when we experience something that allows us, if we are prepared, to acknowledge its importance, to transcend who and what we have been and become something we couldn't have imagined. Think again of a religious conversion. Say, for instance, Saul on the way to Damascus. I'm a lifelong atheist. Sorry. But I'm convinced of the potential for spiritual moments of awakening in all of our lives. Ironically, what freed me most, as much as anyone can ever really be said to be set free from racism, was my own racism. I like to compare it to one of those fire jumpers who parachute into the middle of a blazing inferno and fights it by starting a second fire that burns out the first. Equal to my reading and converting me was a small event that took place in a college dining hall one afternoon of my sophomore year. I would very much like to say it was a moment of brilliant light and dazzling understanding, the way reading proved to be, a moment when the grace of the human heart permits one to see others as he himself would like to be seen. But it was not. In fact, it was a moment both vile and ugly, an incident so deplorable that I still cringe at the thought I was capable of such cruelty and ignorance. Yet in order to change, we must sometimes prostrate ourselves in our own wretchedness, like St. Augustine crying to God, "Why is there not at this hour an end to my uncleanness?" I was having lunch with a close high school friend named Steve. Growing up, we'd played baseball and soccer together and had many long philosophical discussions. We enjoyed each other's company, not so much because we were jocks, but because we liked to fancy ourselves as dilettante intellectuals. In college, we talked about Dylan and Camus and mankind. We compared notes about novels, which I'd only just begun to read, and movies, and I shared with him my own secret desire to become a novelist. I was also very close to his father. The man was one of the most thoughtful, open-minded, and generous people I'd ever known. He worked in the South helping to register African Americans to vote. Like his father, Steve was also a kind, generous soul and without a shred of bias in him. On this particular occasion, we happened to see several black students in the food line. They were minding their own business. To this day, I'm not quite sure what prompted me to say what I did. Perhaps it was the prejudiced assumption that I made that they'd gotten into college with grades less than my own, or that their tuition, unlike mine, was paid for by the government. Or perhaps, despite my newly found veneer of culture, it was simply my angry, racist upbringing reasserting itself. Whatever the motive, I did what is unthinkable to me now, but was then little more than a casual expression, one that I'd grown up hearing all around me. To my friend, I referred to the black students with the vilest of racial epithets. Instead of letting it go, simply ignoring it as most people would have at that time, Steve looked right at me. "How can you say that, White?" he cried. "Say what?" I asked. "What you just said." I felt stung by my friend's sudden condemnation, and yet some part of me even then recognized the terrible truth in what he was saying, the despicable nature of what I had just uttered. "I didn't mean anything about it," I replied defensively. "Then don't say it, for Christ's sake. You're too damn smart." Those last words, "You're too smart for that," made me recoil. They've stuck with me for over 40 years. They stung in part because I was debasing those kids just like me, going to school, trying to make something of themselves. But they also stung because they debased me. They called me ignorant, stupid, deplorable. Like a scar from some terrible and unforgettable wound, they have both haunted and chastened me. They are a constant reminder of the deplorable person I was and could still be, if not always, on my toes. You see, the problem isn't so much Trump, though he's certainly done more than anyone in my lifetime to sow discord and to harness all of our innate animosities and prejudice for his own selfish benefit. He's not so much cause as symptom of our national disorder. I've always believed in the notion that a country gets the leader not that it wants, but that it deserves. To paraphrase Cassius in Julius Caesar, the fault is not in our stars, but in ourselves. We like to blame others. It permits us the flattering illusion of innocence. On this subject, there's a wonderfully illuminating documentary by the German director Michael Verhoeven called Unknown Soldier. In it, Verhoeven gives the lie to the widespread post-war assumption in Germany that the atrocities of the Holocaust were committed by a small, evil group of others, Hitler and the SS, and not by the overwhelming majority of quote-unquote good Germans, the Wehrmacht, for instance. When confronted by indisputable evidence to the contrary, Germans reacted quite naturally. They called the evidence fake and blamed others for spreading lies about the fundamental innocence of Germans, of themselves. They didn't see themselves as being in the same deplorable basket with Hitler and Himmler and the SS Einsatzgruppen and killing units on the Eastern Front. They didn't realize that the first time they turned a deaf ear on a racist insult, didn't speak up when they read something in a newspaper they knew to be a lie, or looked the other way when someone was being carted off, they had chosen their basket. The Trumps of the world will always exist and will always be able to take advantage of our innate need to blame others for our sins and our failings. That is, unless or until we can look inward at ourselves. As Vance writes, we need to, quote, ask ourselves what we can do to make things better. The baskets we are born into don't have to be the ones we die in. Thank you. Questions? Any, yes. Oh. What?
I'm sorry to hear about your brother.
Oh, I love it. I don't have to talk to anyone. Right? He said, why the hell do you keep trying to talk? Just stop talking. That's great. That's your question?
Would you, in the future, do you think you would ever not get over, but somehow reconnect with him?
Well, I said, how do we change? You know, how do people change? Fictional characters change. We were in our workshop today, we talked about that moment. Somebody in our workshop, okay, we talked about the issue of how characters change, when they change. Sometimes they get out of control, and characters do change. People change. We see change all the time. I don't hold out that hope that we can change. But I changed, and so I think our people can change. And I think all of us need to look inside and say, how can we change? And we can better. And I'm not letting Trump off the hook at all. I'm saying that when I saw that guy hold me up that sign, it reminded me of beating me. Anything else? No? Yes.
I think you got to the heart of change. It's about honesty. It's all about honesty, about being honest with yourself, okay? Something that's extremely difficult for a lot of people to do because it hurts, But, and whichever, because if you put someone else in the basket, you're also in the basket yourself, okay? You have to be honest about that. I think getting to both of those, showing that you're in both baskets, or were in one basket, and you just jump into another one, okay? That's honest.
And I said that again, I like to hide. I've chosen a lifetime hiding behind fictional characters. I can talk about very different issues. It's harder to, the Sonian and the non-fiction people in the audience know that it's hard, very difficult to write honestly, well, thoughtfully, about that kind of fine balance you have to write. So, yeah. Anything else? Any other questions? Yes.
How much of the change that you experienced happened while you were writing, or was this entire thing written recently in retrospect?
This is wrote the last few weeks. But the change has continued, it's ongoing. There are certain points out a couple of watersheds
great job. And he said he had to quit it because he said it's too important. We need to write about the stuff that's going on now. It's too important. And just quit. He's driving in an Uber, and he's great, feeling great about the stories, right? But also about the philosophy he's writing about. He said at this time in this moment in history, it's like I'm writing in 1933 and I'm going about my little job writing novels and something else going on. But anything else? Yes.
It's powerful, right? Like family, write about family like that. It's something that takes a lot of courage. Have you written about family? Is that something, is that to share that if you were to publish that or something? And is that a challenging thing to step over when, I don't know, your father's still alive, but to be so public and honest about family and how do you
The father, mother, the brother's also alive, and the one who I call Cessna, would probably take it as a compliment, I think. Okay, and the others, I don't know, he would just be proud to see himself, embrace himself in churches. I don't usually, I've written a number of essays about family, and a number of my books and short stories were usually disguised nonfiction, where my brothers, my then mother was living, would read itself as my brother, as me. So I've done that, but I haven't done it like this. Good.
Oh, I did. I was trying to formulate the question, but how difficult is it to acknowledge the privilege and then to actually expose the privilege and risk losing the privilege?
That's a great question. I don't have an easy answer. You know, when you are at a certain point, somebody like a group like the candidates, they can say they can be beneficent, they can be generous, and do things like that. But they're at a certain point. People down here are fighting for scraps, and some will often say, well, if I don't fight for it, somebody will get it. Okay, so there's that issue. I think at some point you say, well, what's fair? What's decent? When I look at those kids that I said that thing about, just went to school. You know what I mean? Went to school. They're important things that people go to school. There's a great thing that happened, I think it was either in the 1790 rebellion in Ireland, or 1802. But finally, the Catholics and the Protestants, the poor Catholics and Protestants got together and fought the overlords for the first time. Instead of fighting each other down here for scraps, they fought the people that control the power. First time that happened. But it is hard to give up privilege. It is hard to say, this stuff here on my skin, it can be all sorts of advantages in life. It has. People don't see the other stuff about me, the things that I didn't have. But I had to, and I still have to, and I try to convince others because of the battle. I've tried to say to my brother, he says, listen, I worked for every damn thing I got. Don't tell me I should give up everything. I should do more. I struggled and fought. It was my smarts and my hard work and 14-hour days. I said, yes, but there's also this. But also at the same time, you're collecting Obamacare now. Come on. You're railing against it. There's this kind of built-in hypocrisy. And it's hard to get people who are comfortable and say, gotta give up some of your comfort. All of us here, if we want to take a huge step down, we can give more to